Hey friends, it's a quick short video on membrane excitation. Various ways in which the excitable cells are excited. So let's start with the basics and understand this concept of membrane excitation. First things first, the cells, all cells in the body, they have excess negative charges lined up on the inner aspect of the membrane. And this creates the membrane potential. And the cells are in a resting state, that is minus charges or negative potential just on the inner aspect of the membrane. Before we proceed, let me also tell you that whenever we talk about a potential, whether it is resting potential, action potential, depolarization, repolarization, hyperpolarization, we are essentially talking about a potential just inside of the membrane. With that clarity, let's proceed further. So here is a resting cell. Now if inside of the membrane becomes positive, this is called as the membrane excitation. And whichever cell shows this event, it's called as the excitable cell. Point number one. Alright. Now, which cell shows this kind of a membrane excitation? We will see that in a while and with the various ways. Just add one more point here. Now, membrane is resting. We call it cell is in a polarized state, or membrane is having a polarity with more negative charges lined up just inside the membrane, inner aspect of the membrane. This is a polarized state. When this polarity gets disturbed, and membrane on the inside moves towards positivity, positive potential, we will call it depolarization. So one more phrase to be added is that depolarization is membrane excitation. And when this polarity will get restored, we will call it repolarization. Alright, so depolarization is equal to membrane excitation. The only point is now, which cells show this kind of a depolarization and membrane excitation? Well, major chunk is nerve and muscle. These are the excitable cells. But apart from these, there are many other cells, like pancreatic beta cell is an excitable cell. Its membrane is going to excite. Or the receptors in the skin which depolarize and then signals are sent, they are excitable cells. Hair cells in the cochlea, excitable cells. All these cells which I mentioned just now, their membranes excite. Membranes show excitation, inside turns positive. That being said, now let us see various ways of membrane excitation and what channels are involved, what ions are involved. And to begin with, let's say membrane excitation can occur in two ways. A cation on the outside, from the outside it comes in and just lines up on the inside of the membrane, membrane depolarization. So a cation coming in like sodium or calcium, or intracellular cation like potassium, which is high in inside the cells. From the core of the cell, it just comes near the membrane and gets accumulated on the inside of the membrane. Even this is the excitation, because after all, membrane is going to excite. So either the cation comes in, or intracellular cation from the core just moves towards the membrane. Alright. With that background, let's see the various ways and ions involved in excitation. Starting with the most common one, that is sodium influx. Keep this in mind that the cation will diffuse in by its own concentration gradient. This cation has got to be high on the outside of cell and low on the inside, which is the case with sodium. So this is the commonest way of excitation, and is seen in the nerves, muscles, all types of muscles. And the channels involved are voltage gated sodium channels. So there's a family of channels called as NAVs, sodium voltage. And there are subtypes, NAV 1.2, NAV 1.8. This NAV 1.8, for example, is involved in the transmission of pain. The neurons involved in the transmission of pain. Next, calcium influx. Well, yes, you know the area where this happens, or the cells. The myocardial cells. Many cells in the heart, they show depolarization by entry of calcium. And here, there are channels which are CAV type channels, calcium and voltage gated, or they are also called as L type voltage sensitive calcium channels. L stands for long lasting. Alright, so calcium influx, for instance, in the SA node is responsible for the depolarization of the SA nodal cells, but there are other ions also are involved. Let me add one more point here, and that is the ions are changing their place. Sodium, calcium, they are going to the other side of the membrane. Once the job is done, they have to be sent back, isn't it? Otherwise, the event will stop happening. So, these ions are sent back by some kind of a mechanism. In the case of nerve, it is sodium-potassium pump. The sodium-potassium pump will pump the sodium out, which has come in. In the case of calcium, which has come in the heart cells, it's going to be NCX, sodium calcium exchanger, it sends the calcium out. All right, now coming to the third and fourth way of excitation, little more interesting. Potassium influx. Yes, potassium influx. Where does this happen? Is it possible? Yes, it is possible. It does happen. We said just now that the potassium can, the cation can come in if its concentration is high on the outside and relatively less on the inside. So by concentration gradient, it will come in. What about potassium? You know the potassium is high inside the cells. For all the cells in the body, potassium is high intracellularly and low on the outside. So how is it that the potassium can come in? How will it that the diffusion can occur? It occurs at one place in the body, and that is hair cell in the cochlea and in the labyrinth. In the labyrinth, in the cochlea, in the vestibular apparatus, the receptor cell is the hair cell. And what you should remember is that the fluid that surrounds the hair cells is called as endolymph. And this endolymph surrounding these hair cells, this is rich in potassium. Yes, this being, in spite of being extracellular fluid, this endolymph, it is rich in potassium. Because there is a highly vascular area outside the basilar membrane, for instance, stria vascularis, and this is continuously secreting potassium ions into the endolymph. So, rich potassium concentration or high potassium concentration on the outside. That means it is creating a favorable concentration gradient as well as electrical gradient for the potassium to go in to the cell. The question is, from where does the potassium enter? This is the flask-shaped hair cell, and at the top of the hair cell there are these hair or stereocilia. At the bottom of the stereocilia, means at the top of the hair cell, there are those potassium channels. They are being studied, yet so far there is not much information as to what type of channel it is, but potassium enters through these channels. Only thing that is known is that these are mechanosensitive potassium channels. Yes, mechanosensitive. Why is that? Because whenever the hair cell is going to depolarize, what happens is there is bending of the stereocilia in one direction, and this bending of the stereocilia or hair just simply snaps open the potassium channels at the base of the stereocilia, and therefore they are mechanosensitive potassium channels. Potassium enters This cell was resting at -70. Now the potassium enters, so membrane is depolarized. Hair cell has excited. This potassium is sent out by the channels such as K, C, N types of channels, but there is still research going on as to which channel sends the potassium out in this case. Next way of membrane depolarization is if the intracellular potassium, intracellular cation, and most important cation inside the cells is potassium. So intracellular potassium, instead of going out of the cell, just comes near the membrane and lines up on the inside of the membrane, inner aspect of the membrane. So the membrane which was resting, now with these potassium channels, potassium ions lining up, positive charges lining up, the membrane is depolarized, the membrane is excited. You will be able to appreciate this particular way if you understand the fact that excitation of the cell, in the real sense, it means membrane excitation. So cation, potassium, moving towards the membrane and lining up on the inner aspect of the membrane. The question is, where does this happen? There are ATP sensitive potassium channels which sense the ATP, intracellular ATP, and close down. So this happens in the pancreatic beta cell. The cell is depolarized by this potassium. Or there are O2 sensitive potassium channels, they sense the intracellular potassium. So this type of movement and depolarization occurs in the pulmonary blood vessels. Smooth muscle cell lining the pulmonary blood vessel. That smooth muscle cell can be depolarized in this manner by the potassium, which is simply moving from the core of the cell towards the membrane. So these are the various ways, and in this case, last point, in this case, since potassium is not crossing the membrane and going to the other side, there is no requirement of potassium bringing back, because there is no charge that is leaving the cell. So these are the various ways of membrane excitation. This will be useful in your due course of understanding of physiology, whether it is ECG, whether it is secretion of insulin, whether it is smooth muscle contraction, and so on and so forth.